Hello everyone to this episode of We Create EDU. Today we're going to be talking about script writing with the alliterative team and Ashley. So do you guys want to take it away and talk about a little what you do when you're script writing, from the apps you use and the strategies that you use when you're writing scripts?
Sure. Well, I mean, maybe we should go at this kind of chronologically, and what is the first step you do? And I would definitely emphasize the importance of pre-writing stuff. It's so tempting to just jump in there and start writing off the get-go, but I think it's a good idea to take some time to plan out what you're going to do. It'll save you a lot of hassles in the long run. So there's a number of things you can do in pre-writing to, first of all, generate your ideas. I'm sure people are familiar with ideas like brainstorming, mind mapping. I've talked about before in the research episode. I gave some resources there, but we can cover them again. Free writing is another one that I kind of recommend. If you suffer from the kind of writer's block of the tyranny of the blank page, set yourself a short time limit, like 5 minutes, really short, and just write and don't stop. Doesn't matter if you repeat, doesn't matter if what you're writing is no good. Don't go back and edit anything as you go. Just keep writing for the set time limit. And then in addition to that is looping. Look at what you wrote in that first 5 minutes. Pick out the best idea from it and use that as the starting point for another free writing. And you can keep doing that over and over and over again. And you can kind of generate your ideas. It's a way, if you're kind of tentative about writing, it's a good technique to use. I used to use that a lot myself, and I recommend it to a lot of my students. So I think it's a good idea. But if you've done mind mapping, I would certainly recommend that one. It's one that I use now more often. And there are a number of different mind mapping tools. So I would kind of recommend those. I mentioned the brain in the last chat. It's good for both research and for writing. But there are other good mind mapping tools that you can use. There's also the journalist method, also called the pentad. You ask yourself the who, where, why, when, and how questions, and you answer those. That's another good way of you have any other idea generating?
No, my idea generating usually runs along the lines of either I'm standing in front of a class and I have to think of something to say, or I've got a deadline and I have to think of something to say. So I tend to work more on a panic-driven idea generating. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that one. Right. But yeah, no, I mean, for me, usually it comes, often do is just try to pick the thing I'm most excited about talking about.
Yes.
Right. So like not the introduction, not the conclusion, which is always hard, not the proof or the support for the evidence. None of that stuff is usually the thing I'm interested in. Usually I have one thing that was interesting, and I'm thinking of academic writing mostly here, but it works no matter what you're doing, even for writing lecture notes and things like that. The one thing that I found the most interesting, I can usually write that out pretty clearly. Yeah. 2, 3 sentences, 5 sentences, that this is the thing that's interesting. If I just read that, it would make no sense to anyone because I haven't given any of the preamble or any of the lead up. But once I've got that, because if I try to start with the lead up to it and the logical stuff before it, by the time I get to the thing I'm excited about, I've forgotten why it was interesting, why it was more interesting than what somebody else has said about it or something like that. I've sort of talked myself into the boring stuff and into the way everybody's always thought about it. Yeah. So I try to make sure I've written down the thing that I'm most interested in. And then once that's done, go back and say, okay, now what do you need to know in order for that to make any sense? And what's the conclusion and all that?
So you kind of just build a story around that central part.
And that thing that's the most exciting might not be the most important thing about what I'm talking about. Right? Like, so if I'm trying to explain something to a student, the thing that I find the most exciting might not be the most important thing they need to know, but it's the thing I like the most, or that I think is the neat bit that they won't have known before, or the hook or whatever, the hook that's for me. So it may not end up being the center of the story, but to get myself going, it's the part that gets me into it and gets me excited about it. And then I think, okay, well, what else did they need to know in order to understand that? what's the consequence of this neat fact? What does that actually tell them that's important that I want them to walk away knowing, or whatever? But to start with the thing that excites me, and not worry about getting the rest of it down on paper until I've got that part down. I think it works for me.
Yeah. The other crucial part of the pre-writing is outlining. And I know I've heard CGP Grey say outlining is a waste of time. I can't remember if it was on Hello Internet or Cortex, but he specifically said he doesn't do it and he thinks it's a waste of time. But I would disagree with that. I would say outlining is really important. You can save yourself a lot of hassle down the road. You can move stuff around so easily in an outline, but once you've written it all and it's all integrated, the editing becomes much more difficult. So write before you start, producing all the text.
So sorry, go ahead.
No, go
ahead.
I was just gonna say, when you're outlining, like for me, I kind of have what you're talking about, that thing that I think is cool, but I also have like points that I need them to, as students, you know, capture. So is that part of your outline? You're like, these are the things that I need you to learn, and then you kind of mold that into a story.
Yeah. I mean, ideally, so this is where outlining kind of overlaps with paragraphing. Is you want to make sure that each kind of unit of information, whether it's a paragraph or scene in a video or however you kind of think about it, you want to make sure they're unified, so they only deal with one topic, one thing that they need to learn, for instance. And so that should constitute one line in the one major unit of the outline. You can include other, more fiddly details in the outline too. There's nothing wrong with that, but you want to make sure your main headings in your outline are sort of unified. And yeah, since we're talking about educational writing, thinking about it in terms of what are the main points they need to learn, and you can kind of use those as your main headings in the outline.
And it can depend, because if you're doing something more instructional, then steps, or if you're trying to explain a concept, then you need the background steps and the main steps and the whatever. But if you're doing something like a history, or telling about a particular event or a person's life, or trying to explain a philosophical argument, you might have a very kind of different storytelling structure, where you might want to do it out of chronological order, but maybe writing writing it in, say, chronological order as your outline, but in discrete units, allows you to then say, okay, now let me pull the one that's the most interesting up to the front, start with that, and then circle back to the earlier stuff or whatever, because the story is more interesting if you start with a surprising fact. Say you want to hook somebody in. The structures of video writing are not going to be the same as chronological narrative. Is often not going to be the way you're going to want to do a history, or a description of a great battle in Roman history or something like that. You don't want to start with, well, the first thing they did was line up in the morning, because that's not going to catch anybody's attention. You need to start with some element. But when you're doing the outline, if every point goes in chronological order, then it's easy enough to shift everything around. But you've made sure you haven't forgotten something, like, oh, you don't want to halfway through a story go, oh, and did I mention that they lined up in the morning? That's not the way you want to get to it. So, yeah.
And remember to think of your audience. I mean, if you're aiming for your videos to be used in the classroom, then you should think about, what level are we talking? High school students? Are we talking about university students? Keep in mind your audience and try and, as much as possible, target your writing towards that group.
Or if you're thinking about sort of lifelong learners, or people outside the classroom, or dilettantes, that is, I think a lot of us on YouTube are looking at that, which is people who just have a passing interest in the topic and got there through some random click. You want to talk to them differently than if you're trying to do curriculum-based, science experiment discussions, or explaining the basics of physics or something.
And you also have to guess a background for what they already know, probably, right?
Yeah.
And try to give some signal of what your expectations are, in a way that, so that they don't feel like they get halfway through a video and are like, wait a minute, I don't understand anything you're talking about. I mean, if they're not going to understand it, they might as well know that at the beginning. You don't have to not in an off-putting way, but just
Mhm.
like sort of set the expectation fairly clearly, I
Mhm.
think. If that means, use whether or not you use terminology or whether or not you define terms right at the beginning, things like that.
Now, maybe we should move on to paragraphing, I suppose, before we get to
Yep, sure.
revising.
Yep.
So the two things that I always tell my writing students about to keep in mind in terms of how to structure a paragraph is you want to have paragraphs or scenes in the case of videos, I suppose, is unity and coherence. So try to have one main topic per scene or per paragraph. That's the unity. And make sure that everything relates to that one thing. Don't have stuff kind of creeping in that should maybe be a separate paragraph, because that can get confusing pretty quickly. Coherence is, think about the order that you include information in a paragraph. There's no one right order, but you should think about why you're putting things in the order that you do. And there are a number of different orders that you can use. You can use general to the specific. So you introduce a topic, and then you go to illustrations of that topic. Or you can do it the other way around. You can go from the specific to the general. You illustrate, give an illustration, and then you explain it in terms of what topic that illustration kind of demonstrates. You can go from least important to or complex to most important or complex, or you can go from most important and familiar to the sort of less familiar. So there are a number of different ways you can go, but try and pick a sort of order for the information. If you're doing a process, if you're describing, okay, here are the steps to do this thing, then you've got an automatic order given to you. You're going to go in the sort of chronological order of the steps. But if you're describing a concept, for instance, then you don't necessarily have a rigid order to go by. So in that case, you need to think about information in a sensible order that makes sense to the, in that case, if it's an unfamiliar concept, you may want to start with something familiar and then move towards the less familiar. Mm-hmm. Or time and space, time, that would be for process writing. If you're talking about steps to build a thing or to do an experiment, then you're obviously going to go in that order. Or space. So if you're, you could organize it in terms of locations. If you're writing about history or something like that, you may include, different areas. So you could do it geographically in that case. So yeah, that's my main points about paragraphing, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, chronological, hierarchical, causal, logical.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And paragraphs, having looked at a number of people's scripts, I don't know if everyone, and understandably, like when you're writing for scripts for videos, you may not think in terms of paragraphs, because that's a very sort of on the page structure, and it doesn't have to be that when you're writing for a video script. But I do think, whether you think of them as paragraphs or whether you think of them as scenes or whether you just think of them as chunks, that thinking in terms of chunks does help, because because it is how we parse information. Like, we can take information in very small amounts, and in larger amounts, we do want to see them go from one thing to another. And if you say something and then you just move on to another thing, and there's no obvious connection between the two paragraphs, or there's no transition, or if you just list a bunch of stuff in order without any sort of obvious larger structure to it, it makes it harder to take in. It makes it harder to absorb the information, I think. So even though you're not going to put it on the page in paragraphs, I think thinking in paragraphs isn't a bad idea.
So when you say you've looked at other people's scripts and you see like not really paragraphs, but maybe more scenes, what do those look like? Are they just like shorter than paragraphs, usually like
the ones I've
two
seen
sentences or something?
Are just sort of like sentences, they're not writing them for like an essay style, so there's not necessarily obvious punctuation. They're written more sort of like almost, I've seen some people write them sort of like almost in breaths, in a way, like these are the things I would say in a chunk, and then I'd take a breath, and then I'd say these chunks. and then I take a breath and say these chunks, or just they're sort of just laid out in ideas. And I've seen at least some of the scripts I've seen basically are just one block of text, just straight, not divided up. I suspect that a lot of people who do that probably do break it up when they're getting ready to read it. Like if they put it on a teleprompter or something like that, it's going to end up in chunks, because otherwise it's going to be harder to read. But the forms I've seen it in don't sort of show any evidence of an underline. This is not for everybody's I've looked at. It's just I've seen some that don't really seem to show a lot of evidence of a larger scale structure than sentences. It isn't obvious what that structure is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it can be a use for your own purposes to make it into some kind of structure. Looking like when you're actually filming it, that could be totally different. But, yeah.
What next?
I don't know. I don't know that we have anyone chatting at the moment, so I don't think we have questions. So we can...
yeah, there's one person in the chat. I think maybe because we usually do it on Wednesdays and we bumped it up to Tuesday, but its link has been out there for a while. Also, it's the holidays.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably a big thing. That's fine, because people want to see it later. I've just meant that I don't think there's any particular questions, so I think you might as well continue with what we've got. So maybe talk about some of the editing and revising.
Revising is obviously an important step, and one of the most useful things you can do is have someone else read it, because it's very easy to overlook your own, not just errors, but your own sort of hang-ups or verbal tics. And so I think everyone can benefit from having a second pair of eyes on it. Another thing that is also important that you can do yourself is read it out loud. I mean, especially for scripts, since we're going to deliver these verbally, don't leave it to your recording date to be the first time that you read it out loud. Set aside some time before that to read it out, ideally to someone else, but even just on your own, because if you trip over a line, probably that's an indication that you need to adjust the wording, that there's something wrong with the wording.
I would say, like, as you're reading out, just have a pencil and just underline bits that you tripped over. Like, don't even stop and try to fix them. Just put a mark that says, like, I stumbled here, I misread that, whatever. And then go back through and look at all those places and just say, did I write it in a way that's not my own idiom? Is it unclear? Did I have to double read the sentence because I didn't know what I meant by it? Like, anything. Just assume that there might be something wrong there that's worth looking at.
And sometimes it can just be the sound of it, having two words next to each other that don't sound right, or that are a bit of a tongue twister.
Or are totally impossible to pronounce.
Impossible to pronounce.
Definitely happens sometimes. Mark will be reading out and he'll just, because we always do this, and so he reads and I because there's two of us, I make the corrections, or I sort of take notes and correct things as he goes, and he'll stop and he'll like try it 3 times. I'm like, okay, that has to change, because if you can't say it now, I am not editing the 25 takes of that line that it's going to take you. And
I'll often say, ooh, that's a bit of a tongue twister. Yeah. And sometimes there's, something you can do. Sometimes there's no other way to reword it, and then you just have to.
Sometimes it's a Hungarian name, and there's no getting around it. It's going to be a Hungarian name no matter what. But yeah. But reading out, I mean, I'm sure everybody in these videos probably does read their scripts aloud before they record them, but if you do it, with an ear to it, also be a good time for proofreading. That's useful.
Chat has a suggestion that they do.
Sorry?
The chat.
Yep.
Says instead of marking it and coming back to it, whenever he hits a snag, he looks it up and tries to naturally finish the sentence out loud. So I guess like redoes it right there.
Oh, right. Like whatever comes out and write that down. Yeah, and that makes sense too. If something else, that's definitely, if something else comes out than what you wrote down, it's worth thinking about, was that better? Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I do that. Sometimes in reading, I will just not follow the script as it's written on the page.
And then I'll usually say, wait, what did you mean that? Is that better than what we have on the page? Should I change it to that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure.
It's much easier to catch that earlier. I believe you were talking about Gray before, and I think he just wanders around his office reading and rereading all his scripts for 50 drafts. But it's much easier than when you have already set up all the lights and all the cameras and all that.
Yeah, you don't want to have to switch it then. You can possibly catch it before that.
Some other useful editing tips. Look for things like wordiness, and this is not necessarily applicable to everyone, but certainly something that a trap that I fall into is kind of wordiness or redundancies, repetition, empty phrases, anything that can be kind of removed without changing anything. If it doesn't change anything, leave it out, right? Less is always better. You want to aim for simplicity, and I know that's a trap that I fall into. So I mean, I guess the sort of the main point that underlies this is be aware of your own hangups. Everyone has their own tics or things that they do a lot, and try and familiarize yourself with what issues you might have, and look for those. You know, with each new script that you write, you'll save yourself a lot of trouble down the road, I think.
Which does not mean strip out all the idioms you use. No, it doesn't mean like don't say this word because you say that word too much. I mean, I think sometimes people feel like you have to pull out everything that makes it sound like you, because you get so used to, get so sick of hearing your own voice and hearing your own mannerisms. I think you want to sound like yourself, and that can mean using certain kinds of phrases and things, but yeah. Is that you, Jacqueline?
No, that was from the chat.
Okay, yeah. Since you mentioned having someone else edit, I have a hard time with that. The other person doesn't know where I will be inflecting or pausing and such, and I'm not going to put that in my own script. You see, that's where probably the fact that we're both such on-the-page writers as a background comes into it. Like, both of us write. Those things are marked into the script by punctuation and stuff like that, because we're used to writing for reading. But yeah, I mean, I know that that's a problem. As we talked recently, actually, to a little while ago, to Mike Duncan. I don't know if anybody here knows Mike Duncan. He's a podcaster. He does the History of Rome. He's quite a well-known podcaster. He's now doing Revolutions. We talked to him because he had a book out, and he said he wrote the book, and he sent the book off, and he'd done, hundreds of hours of scripts, hundreds and hundreds of hours of scripts. And he sent the book to his editor, and his editor wrote it back and said, do you know you haven't used a single comma in this entire manuscript? And he said, oh, I guess I don't put commas in. So it's exactly that he, he hears when he wrote his script, he never put commas. I mean, periods, yes, but no commas. He knows where his inflections are. He knows where his pauses are. And he had to go through and consciously put commas in. And his editor had to put commas in, because you can't do that. Like, you can't do that in writing. And I thought that was really funny, because like we are obsessional about making sure the commas are in exactly the right places so that Mark has this sort of performance script to read from, which is totally both result in the same thing, but it's a different way of doing it. So I get that problem. There's a couple of different ways around it. One is to mark those things into your script for the benefit of somebody who's editing. Another is to say to the person who's editing it, what I want you to look for is repetitions and redundancies, or I want you to look for things that aren't clear, to ask them the specifics, because especially if you're writing them a more conversational style script, where you might not write out every sentence, you might not write out every phrase because you want it to be kind of semi-improvisational. Like, again, you write a very scripted thing that is every word is scripted. Lots of people don't. And that doesn't make sense. So then if you tell the person who's editing it, like, this is what I want from you. I want to know, does the sequence of thought follow logically? Give them some particular things you want. Because, one of the reasons to have somebody read over is just because maybe something makes sense to you and it doesn't make sense to them. And all the inflections in the world are not going to make that make sense. So they may not, you may not want them to give you back, marked up, changing your conjunctions and checking to make sure you've said that instead of which, or which instead of that, or whatever. But it still might be worth having somebody take a look at it.
Mhm.
But I can see that it really depends what you write for yourself and what the sort of product that you produce for your own script is.
And definitely go to the script advice channel on the Slack, and get another YouTuber to.
And one of the ways to do that too is to say to somebody, "Hey, go watch another of my videos and then read my script."
Yeah.
Because if you have a particular sort of way of performing, that'll probably transfer pretty easily over from one video to another in terms of being able to read it and understand it. I've always got a. I may not be the right person to edit all the time, but I've definitely always got a red pen in hand, ready in that script advice Slack channel. I like it. I'm happy to edit. If anyone wants to drop something off there.
I pasted the wrong thing in the sidebar, but they followed up.
I felt they were very, very emphatic about it. You repeated the same comment. They really meant it.
Now they followed up and said clarity is a hard one since they also don't know what's going to be on screen at that moment. But I have Tim read mine for clarity pretty much. He doesn't do the grammar and stuff as much. And what happens is what you guys were saying. Sometimes he'll rewrite things, but I can't say what he rewrites because it's not my voice. So I literally can't speak that. But for clarity, sometimes I'll storyboard things when I send it to people, especially like my derivative one. It was all math equations. No one's going to understand. Like I had to write out the words I was saying, but you can't like understand it. So I would send a Google Doc with images, like storyboards in between.
Right.
I don't know if that helps. If you guys have better suggestions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is like there's some sort of creative ideas because maybe the kind of scripting you're doing is not scripting. It is in a sense storyboarding, verbal storyboarding, saying, okay, I want to talk about this, and then I want to talk about this, and then I want to talk about this. These are the subjects I want to discuss, not the word by word, especially if you don't know what you're going to be reacting to. It, I don't know who it is who's chatting because I can't see the chat. So who's that channel?
Knowing better.
Oh, right. Okay. So right. So you don't lay out what you're going to put up necessarily, your images and things like that until after you've done your writing, or is it that you just don't put that in the script to somebody else?
He said he doesn't. Life is hard enough. Why would I storyboard for one person? Usually, I'm not talking great storyboards. I'm talking like sometimes stick figures, or I write in parentheses because it's for me too. When I write a script, I think we're going to talk maybe about Scrivener later, but I corkboard it. So I have my entire script by scene, and then I write out the scenes on the side because I have B-roll I have to film, I have animations, and when I get into those modes, I need to know what I'm putting in the scenes. So sometimes I'll just add that into whatever I'm sending to Tim so he knows what's going to be there because I need it anyway for me. Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously, if it's more work to prepare a script for somebody else to read, to edit, then don't do it, If it's not a useful use of your time, then it doesn't make sense to do it. But if you're worried that your script, if you have an issue with it, or if there's something that you think, if this is something you want to work on improving, one of the ways of doing that is having somebody else read it. But it doesn't necessarily make sense to have everything read by somebody else if it takes you a lot of writing out that you won't necessarily do for any reason except having it edited. Then sure, it doesn't make sense. Reading it yourself, though, probably still does, because you do know what you want to say. So,
Brian says that his storyboards are triangles with circle heads.
Yeah.
That's all you need.
Yeah. Just a little indication. Exactly. The other technique that we talked about outlines earlier. One way of, especially if you're not giving it to somebody else, or if you really want to make sure that it all makes sense, one thing I've sometimes done, especially after I've, say, written something out and then moved a bunch of stuff around, is do a reverse outline. If I have my script, take the first sentence in every paragraph, if that's how I've organized it, or the first sentence in every section, pull them out, and just list those just by themselves. And read those. Does it make sense? topic clear in that first sentence? And are they in the right order? Can I look at that and say, yeah, okay, that makes sense? Or because I found that sometimes doing that really reveals that it doesn't make sense. I did that. This is an extreme version, but I did that actually for at least one chapter of my thesis, my PhD thesis. I actually pulled out the first and last sentence of every paragraph in my like 45-page chapter because I just couldn't make it. The structure just didn't work. It kept not working. I kept not being sure where to put what. And I pulled out the first and last sentence of every paragraph and just wrote that into one document and read it and was like, no, this section obviously doesn't go here. That needs to go there. And it really helped because I'd gone so far from my original outline. I mean, I know it took me 6 years to write my thesis. So by the time I got to the end of it, I didn't remember any of my intentions at the beginning. Anyway, that's an extreme version, but I kind of found that useful. So
yeah, that's a good tool. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that makes sense. I mean, obviously, if there's a particular thing you want to check, like, what is my tone like? Are the people going to hear the joke I make as a joke and not as something nasty or whatever? Like, that's definitely worth running that by somebody else. And giving someone a targeted request, like, read this and tell me X, is often going to get you a better response than just read this and tell me what's wrong with it. Because that's hard. Because people don't know what you want out of it necessarily.
And they could tell you something that's wrong that you just don't really care about.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the timing thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or grammar or something, you know, because grammar's not that important at all, frankly. It really depends on the format of something. Yeah. So somebody sitting there and marking up your grammar when you don't care because it's supposed to be informal it's a waste of everyone's time. Mm-hmm. Okay.
What else? Skills.
Well, that's just what we talked about a bit, but
précis writing. So if you're like me, you write too much, and you're always looking to shave stuff off. But I would always say less is better, anyways. So précis writing is a technique for reducing the wordage without losing the ideas. You try and boil things down to the essential points and eliminate the window dressing, I guess.
The thing about that is that it's a skill best built by practice.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that any of us have the time to put in like extra practice writing that isn't actually producing a script. I know, you know, it's the sort of thing we did in high school, and I think it was a really valuable thing to do in high school, but it's not something I really feel like doing. But, you know, you take a longer paragraph and you try to figure out what are the actual, you know, divide it, get it into a third of the words.
Yeah.
And say, I have to get this down to a third of the words. And yet you still have to know the same things at the end of it as you did at the beginning. But that doesn't mean it's what you want to do to every script. No, you need to start with the script and get it down to a third. But it is a skill that you can work on. It's things like taking out certain kinds of comparisons, or tightening sentence structure, reducing a convoluted sentence structure to a more straightforward one, turning longer sentences into shorter sentences so you have fewer dependent clauses, eliminating unnecessary adverbs, unnecessary adjectives, that kind of stuff. Though on that note, I will say there was a piece of advice going around on Twitter saying that writers should eliminate all adverbs and all adjectives from their prose, and it'll be much better.
Much going too far.
Much and better are adjectives and adverbs in that sentence, for instance, and all is an adjective. I mean, it's a piece of ludicrous. But I do hear that sometimes. No, it's just don't put in adverbs. If you say the word really 17 times in a script, or very, or, you know, interesting, or something like that a whole bunch of times, sure, those probably could come out. But there's nothing wrong with adjectives and adverbs. I just want to.
I don't know if this is jumping ahead, but I think you link some tools that help with that kind of thing, so we don't have to do it ourselves, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, we could go to some of those.
Tools. So if you do want to practice the process of eliminating wordiness, there are some exercises on the site. The online writing lab at Purdue University has a really good collection of different materials, one of which is some exercise. So if you want to practice that sort of thing, they have sample sentences, and you can sort of practice, okay, what do I remove from this? And then they have answers. What is the unnecessary words? What can I take out without losing the main sense of it? How can I simplify the sentence structure? That sort of thing.
But there's other just tips and
other tips about writing. There's lots of resources on the OWL website, as it's called.
And then the other links, and I did see the note you've got in what you copied into the chat. We'll come to that in a moment. The other links that we put were actually ones that other people have suggested in the resources before. There's the passive voice detector. Now, again, I'll just say I do not have the hate on for passive voice that some people do. I think there's absolutely occasions when it is completely appropriate, and just eliminating it as a reflex is not a great idea. But it is certainly true that if overused, it can, and it can make things sound wordier than they need to. So that is certainly worth identifying. That's the dataeyes.com passive voice detector. And Jacqueline has these, so they'll go into the show notes, I guess. And it's definitely, going through and noting all the passive voice that you have and whether or not you want to change that is perfectly reasonable. Just don't feel like you have to change everything. It's not evil, passive voice.
I would suggest the bigger point is to always vary your sentence structure. So don't use any one sentence structure all the time. You want to use passive voice sometimes, active voice sometimes. You want to use short sentences sometimes. You want to use longer sentences. If you overuse any one type of sentence, it loses its effectiveness.
And starts to be boring or sound sort of unnatural, I think. Then the other ones, the parts of speech.info, another link somebody put. I'm not exactly sure how one would necessarily use that for your own writing, other than the fact that it identifies like adjectives and adverbs and things like that. So if you do feel like you have a tendency to be wordy and you want to start cutting some of those out, Grammarly.com, sort of, which I think you use, Jacqueline, can help identify just sort of, sentence fragments and passive voice, and it has stylistic guides, right? Like it has views on the style.
Yeah, that and Hemingway kind of try and tell you if your sentences are too long or whatever. Hemingway definitely tells you like if your sentences are way too wordy.
We can never ever feed either of our writing. It would not be good. I'm all about semicolons.
But sometimes it's nice if you're the one reading the script, because I write in longer sentences, but I do it too quickly, and I need shorter ones for when I'm actually trying to talk.
And that's actually a point. So one of the questions there was any other hints for writing a script for a situation where you won't get multiple takes? And that's tough, for sure.
Yes, tougher. Yeah.
I would definitely say that is a situation where writing short sentences, simple sentences, avoiding passive voice in general, because it'll be longer, it'll be slightly more convoluted. So the simpler and the more in your own voice it can be, the easier it will be to get through it. That's something where you definitely want to read it again ahead of time as much as possible, if you can, to get a sense, not just memorize it, but get a sense of like, is this readable? How easy is this for me to read? How much am I going to stumble? How many problems are there with reading it? Beyond that, I don't know. To be honest, that's not something either of us do a lot, is that kind of sort of on the spot.
No, that's true.
Writing for on the spot. I mean, I do that I do improvisational for lecturing. I don't write scripts for lectures. I write
point form, really.
6 points on a piece of paper, which I forget to look at, is usually how I write a lecture for an hour and a half. But that's different because it doesn't have, that's not a filmed video. I don't have to be short and to the point. In fact, in a lecture, I'll probably repeat myself intentionally multiple times because I want to make sure everybody's understanding me and all the rest of it. So that's not quite the same situation. So I don't know that I have a lot of really good ideas for that, other than just trying to be as crystal clear in your writing as possible so that it's really easy for you to say.
And practice it.
And then if you're not using a teleprompter or something, try and make it a little easier to lead from one point to the next. If you're trying to remember more things, try and make that a little bit easier on yourself.
Really focus on the transitions so that the transitions are really logical and maybe lead very naturally from one thing to the next. Or depending on how you're going to do it, if you can do it in chunks, maybe not multiple takes, but in chunks, then make sure they're very easily separable. The other way to do it.
Sorry, the chat is saying some things. We have a new person, Gonzo. I don't think he or she does educational stuff, but they want to know stuff about script writing. They said they do abstract film about alternative dimensions mostly. So I don't know how much we can help you because we're pretty based in like educational solid things, but
well, a lot of the stuff about we talked about earlier, if you go back and listen to it earlier, the stuff about writing and outlining and editing, I mean, that applies to anything, no matter how abstract it is. You're still going to have some reason to follow.
And Knowing Better also says he has to head out, but he says you want to also balance between being really scripted sometimes and being a little less scripted, which is true.
Yeah, for sure. It really depends. For a lot of people who are, especially if you're doing 2-camera like he does, you want it to feel natural. If it's too scripted, it's going to come across as scripted, and it's going to be harder to be natural, especially the 15th time you read the thing. So absolutely, that kind of point form rather than fully developed makes a lot of sense.
Some other tools you want to talk about?
Yeah.
Sure. So, well, I mean, the big one is Scrivener, which we mentioned briefly before. And it's a really powerful and versatile writing tool. You can write, it allows you to write in small sections that can then be easily rearranged. So you just, grab a section and you move it. And it can be, those sections can be displayed as on a corkboard. With sort of there's space for summary, or what is the main point of this section. You can kind of summarize it on the little cue card on the corkboard, and it's easy to just drag and drop, rearrange. So it's at that early stage of sort of planning out what you're going to do. It can be a great tool for that.
And because of that, my advice for using Scrivener is to write in as small a section as you can manage that still is coherent. Like use their divisions and make a different division for every sentence, if that makes sense, or definitely every paragraph. Definitely, I mean, they can be combined easily afterwards. But if you can break them into the smallest units that make sense to you when you're writing them, then you can easily move them around, and you don't get trapped into sort of one structure that doesn't. Because it's easy to get sort of wedded to a structure that maybe isn't the best one and that you want to turn around. But if you've written them in little separable units, then it feels to you like you can move them easily without.
And it allows you to leave the transitions to the end until you're finished rearranging things and get it in the order that you want. Then you can add in all the transitions from one idea to the next, sort of later in the writing process.
And again, if you leave the transitions to the end, it means you don't get yourself wedded to a particular structure. If you build sometimes you want to build, sometimes the transitions are the point. Like the sort of narrative flow is the thing you really want, and you want the transitions there from the beginning because it doesn't make sense without it. But often, perfect. Thank you, Jacqueline. Yeah. But often you don't, if you've got a bunch of points, write them in without any kind of transition from thing to one paragraph to the next or one item to the next, and then put those in the end when you're really happy with the structure. So so this is what Scrivener looks like. You can do so much with it.
Yeah, I'll just show one of the projects I've been working on. So you can see it as the whole script right here. And as you're saying, you paragraph it or put it into little scenes. So when you're writing and I hit, like, I think Command K, then it chunks it. And then you could go down to each of these and look at them as separate things. And then you can easily rearrange them in different ways. Over here, I put, like, what is it that I'm going to actually show in the scene? And then I put A roll, B roll, animation, stuff like that. And then you're saying corkboard view, and that's what this looks like. And you can rearrange stuff here too, but this is when I'm filming, this is the list of things I need to film. So that's how I do mine.
Yeah, and you can obviously do nested, like, sub units, right? So if you have big units and then you want to add in a bunch of stuff that goes together with that, and then that's the other section. I'm going to point at the screen. That's really going to be useful. But if you can have a whole section that's my research underneath there.
Yeah,
and I find that useful on the bottom, that so you can put stuff that isn't in your actual script, but you can throw anything there. You can put links and websites and images and videos, and also it means you can write stuff and then suddenly decide, oh, I don't know if I want this bit in. Throw it in your research section.
So you don't lose it.
You don't lose it. You don't do anything about it. Right there, you can pull it back if you want. And that makes it easier to cut, I find. Put a file in my research that's just a page where you just, every sentence you take out, you stick it in there. So you haven't lost it. All that work you put into it isn't lost. And it feels easier, I find, sometimes to edit that way. If you don't feel like you're deleting it, you just send it aside. You might use it later. And then later you'll probably find out you don't need to use it, but I find that emotionally it's easier to cut that way.
Yeah, I do that with even like with just Word documents on there for stuff that I don't think I want in the thing, but just so I don't have to get rid of it.
Yes, exactly. It's just sitting in timeout for now, and if you want it, it's always there to come back to.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I like is we do series. So this is like our Arduino series, and I can break it down, and all the series is within one document. So if you're doing stuff like that, it's a little bit easier too.
If you're the sort of person who has writer's block and you find it hard to start, you don't have to write, linearly. You can start in the middle and write chunks in whatever order. You start with the bit that you're most comfortable with and come back to the harder bits later.
And it works really well to translate from an outline to that too, of course, because every cue card can just have the title of your outline points. So write an outline, then break every point of your outline up into a new section, and look, you've already written a document, right? Like, it's already there. It's all good. And then it's just a matter of adding some words in one section and adding some words in another. I find, again, like, because I get anxiety about starting writing projects. So I have to sort of trick myself into getting bits of it done. And then once I'm into it, it's okay until it stops being okay. But it is, for a while. So that, like, doing that as an outline really helps me. And to get the outline together and then just stick in the easy bits, fill in the easy parts, change around the outline. Yeah. It just makes it feel like less of a, like, it doesn't have to feel like a cohesive document until the end. And that sometimes can be very helpful.
Yeah. And there's some other tools in Scrivener, like you can search for words you use a lot, and
it'll
highlight things like that. So there are various other tools. I haven't explored them all myself, but it's got a thesaurus and online lookup tools, and
you can click on a word and it'll go and do like Word does now. It'll go and look for things up online. Yeah. How does it compare to Celtx? I think the answer to that is we don't know, because we don't know that one. Obviously, a lot of people use Scrivener who are actually script writers, that is, who write, television scripts or whatever like that. And there are ways of using it. It's got sort of templates for, a 3-act structure or whatever and things like that. we haven't used that because that's not what we're doing. But if there are particular structures that you want to use, and you can also set yourself templates, if there's a particular kind of structure that you like to use in your videos that you could set up yourself, that it would work for that. Canubis. Yeah, exactly. You can write whatever scene you want and then worry about how to get there later.
How to fit it together later. Yeah.
And then I know a lot of people use Ulysses too. That's a new one that came out, and it kind of does some of the same things as Scrivener. Like it lets you move chunks around a lot easier than Word does, or Google Docs.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know Celtx, so if that's a good script writing tool, then that's a good one to point out to give us the link or whatever, because that might be useful. I know one of the things I like about Scrivener is it's not very expensive.
Yeah,
it's like $80 or something like that
for perpetual license,
and then it'll always update. You don't have to buy the new version every couple of years.
And it's available for both Mac and Windows, and there's at least an iOS app.
Right.
Planning on coming out with an Android version as well. I'm not sure if it's out.
The iOS took several years,
it took a while.
I wouldn't hold one's breath on that.
But the iOS one works really well. It syncs over Dropbox, so you can if you have a sudden idea, you can pull out your phone and type the bare outlines and then come back to it later on your desktop or whatever. So
I just looked it up. What Brian put in the Celtx thing, and it looks way more for actual video creators. It has script breakdowns, cost analysis, budgeting, scheduling, storyboarding, all that kind of stuff. So it's definitely more in depth for the actual production side of things.
Right. Yeah, the script is very much focused on writing and not much else. And research. I would say that it's good for the research stage too. For sure, if that's something that's important to you. It's a good place to amalgamate all your research. The other things that we have in terms of tools that, like in lots of ways, we don't use that many tools. You talked about the Brain last time.
Yeah.
But if there were people who weren't here, it's thebrain.com. It's just a really interesting kind of way of compiling research.
Sort of a mix between a mind mapping tool and a database, and so you can use it to keep track of research. You can use it to generate ideas.
It's particularly good if you tend to do a lot of work in. I think it's particularly useful if you tend to do a lot of things that are on similar subjects.
Right.
That is, so if your channel is just like I do one thing and then I do a completely different topic another day, and it might still be interesting, but it may not be as much use. But if you have a tendency to a series or to do the same kinds of subjects and kind of circle back to material, then it's a good way of compiling the material that you may want to use later down the road that isn't necessarily useful right now.
If you do something cumulative,
Yeah. If you do a lot of general reading and you figure you might use this at any given point, but you're not sure how, it's really good for keeping that kind of information going, rather than like, okay, I need to know exactly how this formula works for this thing. I don't think it has any benefits over like just writing that in a Word doc, but for other kinds of stuff, it works well.
LiveScribe. So if you like the handwritten method, I know Gray likes handwritten scripts.
A lot of people like, especially like taking notes, or if you're sort of brainstorming and you want to be able to kind of draw connections between things or images, or you don't want to be sort of tied to like outlining in a really linear way.
Yeah. Then there are a number of different smart pens that you can use. I use LiveScribe, so you can write. Yeah, no, it's upstairs.
Oh well.
So you write in a special notebook. You just handwrite everything. You can draw pictures. You can do whatever. It also has a voice recording function, so you can speak into your
sing.
iPad, and it will sing whatever. And then it converts the text to computer readable text, and you can
well, it does both.
It does both. It'll keep the
image,
but it will also do OCR, converting it into text, And
so then you have all your notes both as an image. So if you want to look at, things that don't translate into text very well, but you also have it as searchable text. So then you can have your pages of notes that you can cut and paste from into a document, like, straight into, or you can look for, oh, I know I wrote something down about elephants. Where's that bit about elephants? You can search your text for elephants instead of just having to scan through your notes. So it's a good way of having all the convenience of having typewritten materials without having to actually sit and type, because that isn't how not everybody's brains work as well when they're sitting and working on the computer as they do. So.
And it integrates with Evernote really well. So you can set it to automatically upload all your stuff to Evernote, and then it's searchable. So
again, yeah, it's a good way of, if you like taking notes on books as you read and things like that. It's a good way to do that, and you can do it since it's stored in the pen. You don't need to be connected to the internet while you're working. So you can do it at the beach or whatever, and then upload it later. So it means you're not as tied to Wi-Fi and computer and stuff. I say all these things. I've never actually used it, but Mark likes it.
I like it.
Oh, have you guys or anyone in the chat or watching tomorrow ever tried to use dictation to write your scripts?
I tried it once because I thought, I kind of like to pace around and kind of juggle ideas, and I found it didn't really work for me.
Was it just that the dictation wasn't good enough, or
no? Well, I mean, maybe. I don't know. I mean, I should try it again, but I found it just was a bit awkward.
Yeah, for me, my brain didn't work quite that way because I'm too all over the place. That's why Scrivener works for me, because I rearrange it. I don't have that. I tried because I had when I had Lyme disease, I had pains in my wrists and stuff, and I couldn't type as much. So I was trying to use dictation, and it didn't quite work for me. But I thought it would be better because you're supposed to be conversational and trying to write your script aloud, but it didn't quite work.
Yeah, I'd be interested if anybody does do it that way. Kind of interesting to try in the same spirit as free writing, to write yourself an outline first, do your research and write yourself an outline, and then try to improvise it to a dictation. That might be interesting to see, whether to do, a little like what Knowing Better was talking about earlier, trying to get a pre-written structure so that you've got it, and then try to, instead of recording and having to transcribe it, which would be such a pain that it would be never worth the time, try dictating it. That'd be interesting to see what came out of that. Even if you didn't use the whole thing, it might get you some turns of phrases.
It'd be like giving a presentation from PowerPoints.
Yeah. Well, you've got just
the basic ideas arranged in order, and then you just explain them.
Yeah,
but with the advantage of having that then sort of written down for you, you could go back over it and be like, well, that was a little bit weird, and I stumbled here. And
yeah, but I like that idea because you need your facts and stuff to be right, but sometimes I think what I write lacks some of the personality of being conversational and being on screen. So I've been trying to look for the balance of getting the facts right and also adding more, personality to it. And sometimes it's hard to turn what you wrote, even if you practice reading it aloud, into that. So maybe starting the other way would be a better way to do that. That's an interesting idea.
Right? Yeah, and actually what also might be interesting, depending on whether you have the context to do it and it's a patient audience, would be doing it in front of someone. Write yourself an outline and then find somebody who's willing to sit there and go to you while dictate it, but explain it to somebody who's sitting there, and then you get that sort of conversational aspect, and then go back over that and turn it into something a little more polished. If anyone does that, let me know if that works, because it sounds to me like it could work especially for that more sort of two-camera conversational style. Like, I don't know if it might work for you, but it might not be what you're aiming at for the kind of voiceovers you're doing. But for other kinds of presentational styles, it might work really well. So let me know if anyone does that. I think that's...
Well, the other thing to mention is Google Docs. The only thing I would recommend for is it's useful for sharing. So if you're going to have someone look at your script, use Google Docs, and you can track changes just like you can in Word. So
It's not the best word processing
it's
format,
not, yeah,
but
it's not a great word processor, but for sharing and tracking changes, it can be useful.
And comments.
Yeah.
Comments.
It's way better comments than Word, I think.
Yeah, actually it does, yeah.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah.
Brian wants to know, is voiceover versus face-to-face camera writing any different from each other writing-wise?
I tend to think of voiceover as being, maybe this is just a channel, but I tend to think of voiceover as being more formal and more constructed, and like, you know, more carefully precise. But of course it doesn't have to be. You know, there are people who do very sort of informal voiceovers for in animation, so I think it really depends. I think more it's about like what kind of density of information are you trying to get across, and how convoluted of a story are you trying to tell. Like, you know, the ones you do, Mark, are quite convoluted,
quite dense,
and quite information dense, and so I think of them as needing to be quite carefully constructed and planned and written. But you know, that isn't. You could do that to the camera too if you had a better teleprompter and, you know, felt like editing a lot.
Yeah.
For all of the mistakes you made. But you know, it's not that it's a voiceover that makes it that. It's the kind of density of information, I think. So maybe I was using voiceover there as a shorthand for something else, not exactly what I meant it to be.
Yeah, when I
podcasts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Conversational.
Yeah, but podcast, we don't write scripts for our podcasts.
Scripts. No, that's true.
No. Whereas some people do.
Yep.
Certainly. So. Yeah.
But when I do voiceovers, I also edit it a lot tighter because I can, and I don't like hearing the breath sounds if you're not seeing someone, because I think it stands out more. So then it becomes very intense, like information when I've noticed when I edit it that way, because I delete silences and breath noises and all the pauses your brain has to figure something out for sound quality, or the fact that I don't want to animate for that long. I want it to be shorter.
Yeah.
So those are some traps I fall in that maybe I should think a little bit differently if I'm doing voiceover.
No, I mean, I understand. Like, we totally do that too. The way Mark does, you know, the way we do the voiceovers, I edit them really tightly. In fact, if you listen to some of our earliest ones, they are kind of psycho fast. And we were trying to be really, Mark was like, I want these fast. It was the kind of YouTube style, like the Hank Green edit every single thing out, you know. But the thing was, the information you were doing was so dense.
Yeah.
And the first few, we did get people saying, like, I can't follow this. I just can't keep up. So we tried to let them breathe a little bit more. But I say let them breathe. I still cut the breath out. Like, put in more silences. I still cut the breaths. I even cut the breaths a fair amount in our podcasts, which is overly finicky. That's why it takes me so long to edit them. But yeah, I get really, and it's weird because I don't get antsy about listening to other people's podcasts with the breaths, but I can't stand them in ours.
When we turned We Create EDU into a podcast for a while, I was the same way, and I could tell everybody's like I could see the voice signature, and I would know whose it was. That's how I know. Bad it got.
Yeah, I'm the Shatner-esque pauser, and Mark's the so we have I have these weird pauses all the way through, and Mark has these ums and uhs, and I cut it all. Anyway, sorry, that's sort of not writing related.
But I know you guys got to get going, so we're just
that was pretty much all the advice we had. I don't know if it's helpful for people.
The chat, do you have any questions? And anyone that's watching this later or talks in the Slack, I'd love to hear more about how people write. Like, I loved your tip where you said you take the most interesting part and you make sure you have that first, and then you kind of go from there. I'd love to hear how other people do it. How do you write your story? How do you outline? How do you do that kind of stuff? I put links to CGP Grey's stuff down in the description of the video for anyone that wants it. He goes over 2 of his different drafts of scripts that he's done. You can see how he's tightening it up as he's going through. So I'd love to learn more about that stuff from anybody in the Slack.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I was interested.
Do you have anything you want to plug about the script channel before we go?
Only that yeah, I'm happy to, and it doesn't have to be exchanged. Like as far as I'm concerned, if people want to put stuff up and never look, like we kind of haven't been posting ours recently, but that's fine. Like if this, and as Knowing Better was saying, if you have a specific question that is often very helpful, like I'm happy to just randomly do stuff, but everybody's scripts are going to be different. So if you want to say, I'm worried this isn't flowing right, or I just have to, you know, I want this to be funnier, though I'm bad at that. That's not my it's not my skill set. Somebody else might have that skill set. Or, you know, I want to make sure this that I'm not, you know, I want to tighten this up, or this part feels like it's not clear to me, or I don't, is this part understandable? You know, anything like that. I think that's useful. And I just, if anybody wants to do it, just put it up and you can ping me, or I'm always looking for excuses to do edit somebody else's writing instead of marking my writing, which now that I think of it does not make a lot of sense. I'll probably notice.
And the day before VidCon event, one of the panels we're going to try and do is a script swap. So people think about what scripts you want to bring. It could be a new one. It could be an old one, probably, right?
Yeah, I think either way, like if it's new, great. But if you don't have something new or on the line, bring something older and just kind of do it as a practice session. And then also give somebody else practice at looking at somebody else's writing.
Yeah, you get as much from editing someone else's writing as having your writing edited. I think you learn a lot. So it's
So yeah, I think that like for that session we really want to have people bring something with them that is like printed out and ready to be marked up, and we'll have, you know, exchange, and we'll talk a little bit about, maybe we'll have like some things for how you mark it up, and easy ways of discussing scripts or discussing writing, and we could just do that.
I'll try and bring a lot of red pens.
Yeah.
Well, and what we could even do, I mean, I'll think a little bit more about it before, you know, but one of the things that might be worth doing is bring, say, 5 copies of a script, so that it could be read by, you know, if we have an hour, and everybody's scripts are probably only going to be 5 to 10 minute long scripts, you know, they're going to be pretty short, really. Exchange it a couple of times and see what a couple of different people have to say. I think that might be interesting. And, you know, everybody get a chance to read a couple of other people's scripts.
Yeah.
So we can maybe do some exercises like précis writing with it, or I mean, depends on the time. We don't want to take too much time on it. Or reverse outlines or whatever. Cool.
Well, thanks so much. Sorry your internet wasn't working so well, Ashley.
We appreciated the nodding, though.
Yeah, sorry, I was quiet. It's a little laggy for me, and I didn't want to jump in a weird spot.
No problem.
Love the tips especially about finding the interesting part and then working around that.
Yeah,
that's really helpful. Yeah.
Cool.
Well, thanks everyone. Thanks chat, and we will see you guys next year.
Yeah, happy holidays.
Yes, happy holidays, everybody.
Bye.